I stood at the edge of Interstate 40, my worn hiking boots caked with mud from 3 different states, rain soaking through my jacket for the 4th time this week. Cars rushed past me at 70 miles per hour, their headlights cutting through the darkness like judgmental eyes. In my backpack was a crumpled hospital letter that had arrived 6 days ago, the words still burning in my memory. Terminal diagnosis. Weeks remaining. Next of kin notification. My son Marcus was dying, and according to everyone in his life, I had been dead to him for the past 8 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The letter shouldn't have even reached me. Marcus had moved heaven and earth to erase me from his existence, telling his friends, his wife, his coworkers, even his doctors, that his mother was deceased. But hospitals have ways of finding people, and somehow, that thin envelope found its way to my apartment in Oregon, shattering the careful distance I'd maintained between us. Now here I was, walking across the country, because I couldn't afford a plane ticket, and my car had broken down 200 miles back, determined to reach him before it was too late. My name is Nadine Barnes, though everyone's always called me Nady. I'm 53 years old, 5 feet 4 inches of stubborn determination wrapped in weathered denim and flannel. I've been walking for 6 days straight, covering roughly 30 miles each day when the weather cooperated, less when it didn't. My destination is St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, where my 28-year-old son lies in a bed, probably still telling anyone who'll listen that he doesn't have a mother. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm racing towards someone who spent years wishing I was actually dead. But when you're a mother, some bonds refuse to break, no matter how hard your child tries to sever them. Even when that child grows up to be a successful architect with a beautiful wife and a life so perfect it doesn't have room for the woman who raised him alone in a trailer park outside Portland. I remember the exact moment Marcus decided I was dead to him. It was October 15th, 8 years ago, the day I showed up at his college graduation ceremony in clothes I'd bought from Goodwill. My hands still stained with grease from the double shift I'd pulled at the auto shop just to afford the bus ticket to get there. I'd been so proud, watching my baby boy walk across that stage in his cap and gown, the first person in our family to earn a college degree. I'd worked 3 jobs for 4 years to help him through school, skipping meals so I could send him money for books, lying awake at night in that cold trailer calculating how to stretch $20 until my next paycheck. But when I tried to approach him after the ceremony, when I called out his name with tears streaming down my face, he looked right through me like I was invisible. His girlfriend at the time, a pretty blonde named Catherine, whose parents owned a vineyard, whispered something in his ear. I watched his face change, watched embarrassment replace whatever affection might have been there. He turned away from me and walked into his new life, leaving me standing alone among the families celebrating their children's achievements. That was the last time I saw Marcus face to face, though I'd tried to maintain contact for 2 more years. Phone calls that went straight to voicemail, letters that came back marked return to sender, emails that bounced back from deactivated accounts. He'd changed his last name from Barnes to his father's surname Hawthorne, even though his father had never been in the picture. The message was clear. He wanted nothing connecting him to Nadine Barnes, the mechanic from the wrong side of town who'd embarrassed him in front of his new world. So I stopped trying. I learned to live with the silence, to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for my phone to ring. I kept working at the shop, saved up enough money to take night classes in bookkeeping, eventually started managing the shop's finances, along with fixing engines. I dated a kind man named Robert for 3 years, though it never went anywhere because I couldn't explain why I always seemed to be grieving something I couldn't name. I made friends with my neighbor Mrs. Chen, helped her with her garden, learned to cook Chinese food that reminded me of the takeout Marcus and I used to share on Friday nights when money was tight. I built a quiet life, a peaceful life, but never a complete one. There was always a Marcus-shaped hole in the center of everything, a space where my son's voice should have been during holidays, where his children should have been running around my small apartment, where his stories about work and love and dreams should have filled the silence between us. Then came the letter. I'd been sorting through mail after another long day at the shop, my hands still smelling like motor oil despite the industrial soap I'd scrubbed them with. Most of it was bills and advertisements. nothing that couldn't wait until morning. But there, nestled between a credit card offer and a furniture store flyer, was an envelope from St. Mary's Hospital with urgent next of kin notification stamped across the front in red letters. My hands shook as I tore it open, and for a moment I couldn't process what I was reading. Marcus Hawthorne, age 28, had been admitted with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was terminal, with an estimated survival time of 2 to 4 weeks. As his legal next of kin, I was being notified of his condition and his current status in the hospital's intensive care unit. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. My son, my baby boy who used to curl up next to me during thunderstorms, who made me dandelion bouquets when he was 6, who told me he loved me every night until he turned 18, was dying. And he was dying alone, surrounded by people who thought his mother was already in the ground. The letter mentioned that he'd been asking for family, but when I called the hospital to get more information, the nurse who answered seemed confused by my call. According to their records, Marcus's wife Sarah was his only family contact. His emergency forms listed his parents as deceased. When I tried to explain that I was his mother, very much alive, the nurse's tone turned skeptical. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but Mr. Hawthorne has been very clear about his family situation. He's mentioned several times that both his parents died when he was young, which is why this diagnosis has been particularly difficult for him. He feels like he has no one to turn to for support. No one to turn to for support." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here was my son, facing the most terrifying experience of his life, believing he was completely alone in the world while I was 3,000 miles away, very much alive and desperate to be there for him. I tried to explain the situation to the nurse, tried to convince her that Marcus had cut contact with me years ago, but that I was indeed his biological mother. She listened politely, but suggested I might be confused, that perhaps I was thinking of someone else with a similar name. The conversation ended with her promising to make a note in his file about my call, though her tone suggested that note would likely be filed under disregard. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for hours, staring at that letter and trying to figure out what to do. Marcus had made it clear he didn't want me in his life. He'd gone to extraordinary lengths to erase me from his existence, even creating an elaborate fiction about being an orphan to avoid any connection to his past. Showing up at the hospital uninvited would be the ultimate violation of the boundaries he'd set. But he was dying. My child was dying, and he was facing that death believing he was alone in the world. Whatever anger or embarrassment had driven him to cut me out of his life seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that he might die thinking no one loved him, no one remembered the little boy he'd been, no one cared enough to hold his hand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
While he slipped away, I called in sick to work the next morning and spent the day researching flights to Richmond. The cheapest ticket I could find was $800, money I didn't have. My savings account held exactly $237, the remnant of years of careful budgeting and small emergencies that had chipped away at anything extra. I called 3 different credit card companies, but my credit wasn't good enough for the limit I'd need. That's when I looked at the bus schedules. A Greyhound ticket to Richmond would cost $140, leaving me with enough money for food along the way. The trip would take 4 days with transfers, but I could make it work. I bought the ticket online and started packing immediately. I should have known the universe wouldn't make it that easy. The bus broke down outside of Denver on day 2, stranding 40 passengers in a gas station parking lot while we waited for a replacement vehicle that never came. After 8 hours of conflicting information from Greyhound customer service, I was told the next available bus wouldn't arrive for another day and a half. I couldn't afford to lose that time. According to the hospital letter, Marcus had already been there for a week when it was mailed. Every day I delayed could be the difference between seeing him alive and arriving too late. That's when I made the decision that probably seemed insane to everyone around me. I bought a used backpack from a sporting goods store across the street from the gas station, loaded it with everything I could carry, and started walking east on Interstate 76. My phone's GPS told me Richmond was 2,043 miles away. At 30 miles per day, walking for 10 hours with breaks, I could cover the distance in roughly 70 days. But I didn't have 70 days. According to the letter, I might not even have 70 hours. So I pushed harder. I walked for 12 hours that first day, stopping only when my legs literally wouldn't carry me any further. I slept in a truck stop, curled up in a corner booth with my backpack clutched against my chest, and started walking again before sunrise. I ate gas station sandwiches and refilled my water bottles at every opportunity. When it rained, I walked through it. When my feet developed blisters, I wrapped them in duct tape and kept going. The first state line I crossed was from Colorado into Kansas, marked by a simple sign that felt like a major victory. 1 down, 4 to go. Kansas stretched out before me like an endless ocean of wheat fields and empty sky, the highway cutting through it like a gray ribbon that seemed to disappear into infinity. I learned to measure distance not in miles but in landmarks. The red barn that meant I'd been walking for 3 hours, the water tower that marked the halfway point to the next town, the truck stop where I could rest for 20 minutes before pushing on. People stopped to offer rides occasionally, usually truck drivers, who took pity on the woman walking alone with a backpack. I accepted a few of them, but most drivers were heading to destinations that would take me off my route, and I couldn't afford the detour. Besides, there was something about the walking itself that felt necessary, like each step was a form of penance for all the years I'd let Marcus stay disappeared from my life. In Kansas, I called the hospital again from a payphone outside a diner in Goodland. This time, I spoke to a different nurse, one who seemed more sympathetic when I explained my situation. She couldn't give me detailed information about Marcus's condition over the phone, but she confirmed he was still alive and still listed his parents as deceased on all his paperwork. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I can't encourage you to make this trip if your son has specifically requested no contact. Sometimes families have complicated histories, and we have to respect our patients' wishes about their personal relationships." "But he doesn't know I'm coming," I said, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "He thinks I'm dead. He's been telling people for years that I'm dead. Maybe if he knew I was alive, if he knew I still cared about him, he'd want me there." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, the nurse spoke again, her voice softer than before. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Nadine Barnes." "Nady Barnes. I'm Marcus's mother. Let me make a note in his file that you called, Ms. Barnes. I can't promise anything, but I'll make sure it's documented that you're trying to reach him." "Thank you," I whispered, though I knew that note would likely join the first one in whatever digital equivalent of a filing cabinet hospitals used for information they couldn't verify. By the time I crossed from Kansas into Missouri, my feet had developed blisters on top of blisters, and I'd learned to sleep anywhere that provided shelter from the wind. My phone battery died somewhere outside of Columbia, and I didn't have money for a replacement charger, so I navigated by following road signs and asking for directions at gas stations. The map I'd bought in Kansas became my most precious possession, protected in a plastic bag and consulted dozens of times each day. Missouri brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that soaks through everything and turns the world into a gray blur. I walked through it anyway, my sneakers squelching with every step, my backpack growing heavier as it absorbed water despite the garbage bag I'd wrapped around it. I spent one night shivering in a 24-hour laundromat, feeding quarters into the dryer just to sit next to something warm, while my clothes tumbled in circles. It was in Missouri that I started talking to Marcus as I walked, carrying on one-sided conversations with the son who'd written me out of his life. I told him about the promotion I'd gotten at the shop, about Mrs. Chen's granddaughter who was learning to play violin, about the stray cat I'd been feeding who finally let me pet him after 6 months of patience. I talked about the memories he'd probably forgotten. The time we drove to the coast and he collected shells for 3 hours. The Halloween when he insisted on being a dinosaur and I stayed up all night making his costume. The morning he lost his first tooth and left it under his pillow with a note asking the tooth fairy to be gentle because he was nervous. Somewhere between Kansas City and St. Louis, I realized I was crying while I walked, tears mixing with rainwater on my cheeks. Not from physical pain, though my body ached in ways I'd never experienced, but from the weight of 8 years of silence. 8 years of wondering if Marcus was happy, if he'd found love, if he ever thought about the woman who'd raised him. 8 years of carrying guilt about whatever I'd done wrong, Whatever failures had led him to decide his life would be better without me in it. The Missouri-Illinois border was marked by the Mississippi River, crossed by a massive bridge that seemed to stretch for miles above the dark water. Walking across it felt like entering a different world, one step closer to whatever waited for me in Richmond. Illinois brought clearer skies but colder temperatures, and I learned to layer my clothes in configurations that kept me warm while still allowing for the constant movement. I called the hospital again from a payphone in Springfield, using some of my dwindling cash for a conversation that lasted 3 minutes. Marcus was still alive, still receiving treatment, still listed as having no living relatives. The nurse I spoke to this time seemed familiar with my previous calls and spoke with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been instructed not to encourage me. "Ms. Barnes, I understand your concern, but I have to ask, have you considered that maybe your son has reasons for maintaining this distance? Sometimes people need space from their families for their own mental health, especially during difficult times like this." "He's dying," I said, my voice cracking on the words. "He's dying and he thinks he's alone. Whatever happened between us, whatever I did wrong, he shouldn't have to face this by himself." "Ma'am, he's not by himself. He has a wife who's been by his side every day, friends who visit regularly. He's receiving excellent care and emotional support. Sometimes the family we choose is different from the family we're born into." The words stung because they carried truth I didn't want to acknowledge. Marcus had built a life without me, surrounded himself with people who loved him and supported him. Maybe my presence wouldn't be a comfort to him. Maybe it would be just another source of stress during the most difficult time of his life. But I kept walking anyway, because the alternative was going home to my empty apartment and spending the rest of my life wondering if I could have made a difference. Even if Marcus turned me away, even if seeing me caused him pain, at least he'd know that his mother was alive, and that she'd walked across the country to be with him. Illinois seemed to go on forever, flat farmland interrupted by small towns that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. I walked past abandoned gas stations with weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, past farmhouses where elderly couples sat on porches and watched me trudge by with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. In one small town whose name I never learned, an older woman chased me down in her car and insisted on giving me a bag of homemade sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. She didn't ask questions, just rolled down her window and said, "You look like you're on an important journey, honey. Make sure you eat." The kindness of strangers became a theme during those middle days of walking. Truck drivers who slowed down to ask if I needed help. Gas station clerks who let me fill my water bottles for free. Restaurant managers who offered me leftover food at closing time. Most people didn't stop, of course. Most cars rushed past without slowing down, their occupants either not noticing the lone woman walking along the highway or choosing not to get involved. But enough people showed small kindnesses that I never felt completely alone, even during the long stretches where I didn't see another human being for hours. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the blisters or the way my back ached from carrying everything I owned in a backpack. The hardest part was the doubt that crept in during the quiet hours, the voice in my head that whispered that this entire journey was a mistake. What if Marcus really was better off without me? What if showing up at his hospital bedside would cause him more pain than comfort? What if 8 years of believing I was dead had allowed him to make peace with our relationship in a way that my sudden reappearance would shatter? I thought about turning around more times than I can count. There were moments, usually late at night when I was trying to sleep in whatever shelter I'd found, when the rational part of my brain screamed that this was madness. I was a 53-year-old woman walking across the country to see someone who'd spent years actively avoiding me. I was risking my job, my health, and what little financial stability I'd managed to build for a reunion that might destroy both of us. But then morning would come, and I'd remember the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who made me Mother's Day cards from construction paper and glitter, who told me I was the strongest person in the world because I could change the oil in our car by myself. That little boy was still somewhere inside the man lying in that hospital bed, and maybe, just maybe, he needed his mother one more time. Crossing from Illinois into Indiana felt like passing through a doorway into the final act of this strange journey. 3 states down, 2 to go. The landscape began to change. Flat farmland giving way to rolling hills and more frequent towns. I was moving faster now, covering 35 miles on good days, driven by the increasing urgency of reaching Marcus while there was still time. Indiana brought new challenges. The weather turned colder, and I had to stop at a Walmart to buy warmer clothes, eating into my food budget for the rest of the trip. My shoes were falling apart, the soles separating from the uppers in ways that let in water and gravel. I fixed them with duct tape and kept walking, learning to adjust my gait to compensate for the uneven wear. It was in Indiana that I had my first real breakdown. I'd been walking for 18 days, pushing through exhaustion and pain and the constant ache of not knowing if Marcus was still alive. I'd called the hospital every few days, always getting the same carefully neutral responses from nurses who couldn't give me the information I desperately needed. But that morning, when I tried calling from a gas station outside Indianapolis, the line rang, and rang without anyone picking up. I tried again an hour later. Same thing. By the third attempt, I was in full panic mode, convinced that Marcus had died while I was still hundreds of miles away, that I'd lost my chance to see him one last time. I sat down on the curb behind that gas station and sobbed until my chest hurt. 18 days of suppressed fear and grief pouring out all at once. A young man working at the gas station eventually came out to check on me. He was maybe 25, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Tyler. He didn't ask what was wrong, just sat down next to me on the curb and waited until I could speak again. "My son is dying," I finally managed to say between gasps. "I'm trying to get to him, but I think I might be too late." Tyler nodded like this made perfect sense, like sitting behind a gas station crying about a cross-country journey to see a dying son was the most normal thing in the world. "How far do you have to go?" he asked. 600 miles. Maybe 700. I've been walking for 3 weeks. Walking? His eyebrows went up, but he didn't question the logic of it. "That's a long way. You must really love him." "More than anything," I whispered, even though he doesn't want me to. Tyler was quiet for a moment, then stood up and disappeared back into the gas station. He returned a few minutes later with a phone charger that fit my dead phone and a bag of food from the store's deli counter. "Charge this up and try calling again," he said. "Sometimes hospitals are just busy. Doesn't mean anything bad happened." He was right, of course. When my phone finally powered on, and I called the hospital again, I reached a nurse who confirmed that Marcus was still alive, still receiving treatment, still surrounded by people who believed his mother was dead. The relief was so intense I nearly started crying again, but Tyler was watching me with such hopeful expectation that I managed to smile instead. "He's okay," I told him. "Still alive?" "Good," Tyler said, nodding with satisfaction. "Then you better keep walking." Indiana began to feel different after that encounter, less like an obstacle to overcome and more like a series of small communities where people looked out for each other. I met a retired teacher named Margaret who let me sleep in her garage during a particularly cold night, a truck driver named Bill, who bought me dinner at a truck stop and shared stories about his own estranged daughter, a teenage girl named Ashley who walked with me for 3 miles just to have someone to talk to about her plans for college. Each person I met added something to my understanding of why this journey mattered. It wasn't just about reaching Marcus, though that remained the primary goal. It was about the connections between people, the ways we care for each other even when we're strangers, the recognition that everyone is carrying something heavy, and sometimes we can help each other bear the weight. By the time I reached the Indiana-Ohio border, I'd been walking for 22 days and covered over 600 miles. My body had adapted to the constant movement in ways that surprised me. My legs were stronger than they'd ever been, my endurance seemingly limitless as long as I kept moving forward. I'd lost weight, my clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been reshaped by weeks of physical demands it had never faced before. Ohio felt different from the previous states, more densely populated and industrialized. I walked past factories and suburbs, strip malls and housing developments, constantly aware that I was moving through areas where people lived normal lives in permanent homes. The contrast between their stability and my temporary existence as a woman walking toward an uncertain reunion became more pronounced with each mile. I called the hospital again from Columbus, 25 days into my journey, and this time I asked to speak to a social worker instead of a nurse. I'd realized that my approach had been wrong. Instead of trying to convince medical staff that I was Marcus's mother, I needed to focus on getting someone to help me navigate the situation professionally. The social worker, a woman named Janet with a warm voice and infinite patience, listened to my entire story without interruption. I told her about Marcus cutting contact 8 years ago, about the letter that had reached me despite his efforts to erase me from his life, about the 25-day walk across 5 states to reach him before it was too late. "Ms. Barnes," Janet said when I finished, "this is a very complex situation. Your son has been very clear with our staff that he has no living family members. He's built his entire support system around that narrative. Introducing you into his care at this point could be very disruptive to his emotional well-being." "But what if he's only saying that because he thinks I don't care about him?" I asked. "What if he cut contact because he was angry or hurt, but he's never stopped wishing things could be different? What if he's lying about me being dead because it's easier than admitting his mother chose not to be in his life?" Janet was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Barnes, can you prove that you're Marcus's biological mother?" "I have his birth certificate," I said. "I have baby pictures, school photos, medical records from when he was a child. I have everything." "Bring them with you when you get here," she said. "I have baby pictures. I can't promise anything, but I can arrange for us to have a conversation when you arrive. We'll figure out the best way to handle this situation, if there is a way to handle it at all." It was the first time anyone at the hospital had acknowledged that I might actually be who I claimed to be, and the relief was overwhelming. I had 5 days of walking left, maybe 6 if the weather didn't cooperate, but at least I knew someone would listen to me when I arrived. Ohio passed in a blur of determination and anticipation. I was so close now that every mile felt significant, every step bringing me closer to answers I'd been seeking for 8 years. The physical pain had become background noise, something I acknowledged but didn't let slow me down. My focus had narrowed to a single point: reaching Richmond, reaching Marcus, finding out if there was any possibility of healing the wound that had defined both our lives for nearly a decade. The Ohio-West Virginia border was marked by the Ohio River, another massive bridge that seemed to symbolize the transition between my old life and whatever came next. West Virginia brought mountains, the first significant elevation changes I'd encountered since leaving Colorado, and my pace slowed as I navigated hills that left me breathless and shaking. But West Virginia also brought the knowledge that I was almost there. According to my worn map, I had less than 300 miles left to cover, 3 or 4 more days of walking, depending on the terrain and weather, and I'd finally know whether this entire journey had been an act of love or an elaborate form of self-torture. The mountains of West Virginia were beautiful in a way that reminded me why people fall in love with the American landscape. Rolling green hills dotted with small towns, forests that seemed to go on forever, rivers that carved through valleys like silver ribbons. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed the scenery, taken time to appreciate the natural beauty surrounding me, but all I could think about was Marcus, somewhere ahead of me in a hospital bed, facing the end of his life while believing his mother was already gone. I spent my last night in West Virginia in a small town called Lewisburg, sleeping on a bench outside a closed restaurant after the local police officer checked on me and decided I wasn't causing any trouble. It was October now, the nights getting cold enough that I had to wrap myself in my sleeping bag and still shivered until morning. But the cold couldn't touch the warmth I felt, knowing that in 2 days, maybe 3 at most, I'd finally see my son again. The West Virginia-Virginia border came on day 30, exactly 1 month after I'd started walking in that Colorado gas station parking lot. Crossing into Virginia felt like entering the final chapter of a story I'd been writing with my feet across half the continent. Richmond was only 150 miles away, close enough that I could almost taste the resolution waiting for me there. Virginia's landscape was different from the mountains of West Virginia, rolling hills giving way to flatter terrain as I moved east toward Richmond. The trees were beginning to change color, hints of red and gold that reminded me of the autumn Marcus had started kindergarten, how excited he'd been to ride the school bus, How proud I'd been watching him walk up those big steps with his superhero backpack bouncing on his small shoulders. I called the hospital one last time from a gas station outside Charlottesville, 90 miles from Richmond, to let Janet know I was almost there. She sounded surprised to hear from me, as if she'd assumed I'd given up on this impossible journey somewhere along the way. "Ms. Barnes, are you actually going to make it here?" "Tomorrow," I said, my voice hoarse from 30 days of constant use. "I should reach Richmond tomorrow evening." "All right," she said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I've arranged for us to meet when you arrive. I have to warn you, though, this is going to be complicated. Marcus's condition has worsened since we last spoke. He's been moved to palliative care, and his time is very limited. Any disruption to his emotional state could be harmful." The words hit me like cold water. Palliative care. The medical euphemism that meant they'd stopped trying to cure him and were focusing only on keeping him comfortable. I'd walked 30 days across half the country, and I was still almost too late. "How long does he have?" I whispered. "It's hard to say. Days. Maybe a week at most. Ms. Barnes, I need you to understand that even if we can verify your identity, even if we can confirm that you are his biological mother, there's no guarantee he'll want to see you. 8 years is a long time. People change. Situations evolve. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this reunion won't go the way you're hoping." "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure I really believed it. "I just need to try. I need to know that I tried everything." "I understand. When you get here, come to the main information desk and ask for me. We'll start with verifying your identity and then take it one step at a time from there." That last day of walking felt both endless and too short. Endless because every mile seemed to stretch forever, my body finally beginning to rebel against 30 days of constant abuse. Too short because with each step closer to Richmond, I became more aware that this journey was about to end, one way or another. I reached the outskirts of Richmond as the sun was setting on day 31, the skyline of the city rising before me like a promise or a threat. Somewhere in that collection of buildings and lights was St. Mary's Hospital, and somewhere in that hospital was my son, the boy I'd raised alone, the man who'd spent 8 years pretending I was dead. I stood at the edge of the city for a long moment, gathering strength for whatever came next. My feet were screaming in boots that had carried me over 1,000 miles. My back ached from 30 days of sleeping on benches and floors and wherever else I could find shelter. My hands were cracked and weathered from constant exposure to wind and rain and sun. But I was here. Against all odds, despite every rational argument against it, I'd walked across 5 states to reach my dying son. The next few hours would determine whether that journey had been worth it, whether the love I'd carried for 8 years of silence was strong enough to bridge the gap Marcus had created between us. I shouldered my backpack one last time and started walking toward the hospital, toward answers, toward whatever remained of my relationship with the child I'd never stopped loving, even when he'd stopped loving me. St. Mary's Hospital loomed before me like a fortress of glass and steel, its windows glowing in the darkness like 1,000 watchful eyes. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, suddenly paralyzed by the magnitude of what I was about to attempt. For 31 days, walking had been my purpose, my focus, my reason for getting up each morning. Now that I'd reached my destination, the simple act of crossing the street felt impossible. My reflection in the hospital's glass doors was shocking. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the Nadine Barnes who'd left Oregon over a month ago. My hair hung in greasy tangles around a face that had been carved lean by weeks of walking and irregular meals. My clothes, which had been clean if shabby when I started, now bore the stains and wear of a month on the road. I looked exactly like what I was, a homeless woman who'd been living rough for weeks. The security guard at the information desk eyed me with obvious suspicion as I approached. His name tag read Jerome, and his expression suggested he'd already decided I didn't belong in this clean, bright place where serious medical business was conducted. "Ma'am, visiting hours ended at 9, he said before I could speak. "The hospital's closed to visitors until 8 tomorrow morning. I need to speak with Janet," I said. my voice cracking from exhaustion. She's a social worker here. She's expecting me. Jerome's eyebrows rose skeptically. Janet who? We have several social workers on staff? I realized I'd never gotten Janet's last name during our phone conversations. I don't know her last name, but she's been helping me with a situation involving my son, Marcus Hawthorne. He's a patient here. Ma'am, I can't call staff members at this hour based on a first name only. You'll need to come back during regular business hours with proper identification and more specific information. The words felt like a physical blow. I'd walked over 1,000 miles to get here, and now I was being turned away because of visiting hours and bureaucratic procedures. Please, I said, fighting back tears. I've traveled a very long way. My son is dying and I just need someone to help me figure out how to see him. Jerome's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. I understand this is difficult, ma'am, but I have procedures I have to follow. The best I can do is give you information about local shelters where you can spend the night. Tomorrow morning you can speak with patient services about visiting arrangements. He handed me a photocopied sheet with addresses and phone numbers for homeless services in Richmond. The paper felt like a judgment, a confirmation that I looked exactly like someone who needed charity, rather than someone who belonged in this sterile medical environment. I walked outside and sat on a bench across from the hospital, staring up at the building that contained my son. Marcus was somewhere behind those glowing windows, lying in a bed surrounded by machines and nurses, and the wife who'd replaced me in his life. He was so close I could probably hit his window with a thrown rock, but he might as well have been on the moon. The October night was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders as I tried to figure out what to do next. The shelters Jerome had listed were across town, and I didn't have money for a taxi or even a bus fare. I could walk there, add a few more miles to the 1,000 I'd already covered, but the thought of leaving this spot felt like abandoning my post. What if something happened to Marcus during the night? What if Janet tried to reach me and I wasn't here? So I stayed on that bench, dozing fitfully in 20-minute increments, jolting awake every time a car door slammed or a siren wailed in the distance. The hospital never truly slept. I watched ambulances arrive and depart, saw staff members coming and going through the emergency entrance, observed the rhythm of an institution that dealt with life and death 24 hours a day. Around 3 a.m, a police officer approached the bench where I was huddled. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that reminded me of Marcus at that age. "Ma'am, you can't sleep here," he said gently. "This is hospital property, and they don't allow overnight loitering." "My son is a patient here," I said, the words coming out as a whisper. "I'm waiting to see him." "Visiting hours don't start until 8, the officer replied. "I can take you to a shelter where you'll be warm and safe. Bring you back in the morning if you need transportation." I shook my head. I need to stay close. What if something happens? What if he needs me? The officer studied my face for a long moment, and I wondered what he saw there. Desperation? Mental illness? A mother's love that had crossed the line into obsession? "What's your son's name?" he asked. "Marcus Hawthorne. He's in palliative care. Pancreatic cancer." Something shifted in the officer's expression. "How long since you've seen him?" 8 years, I admitted. He cut contact with me when he graduated college. Told everyone I was dead. But when I got the letter from the hospital, I had to come. I walked here from Oregon. "You walked here? From Oregon?" My car broke down, and I couldn't afford a plane ticket. It took me 31 days. The officer was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he pulled out his radio and spoke in low tones to someone on the other end. I couldn't make out the words, but his voice carried an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Ma'am, I'm going to make some calls, see if we can get someone from patient services to speak with you tonight. This situation is unusual enough that maybe we can bend some rules." He walked a few steps away to make his calls, and I sat there marveling at how kindness could appear in the most unexpected places. This young officer had no reason to help me, could have simply arrested me for trespassing or driven me to a shelter against my will. Instead, he was using his position to advocate for a desperate mother he'd met on a bench. 20 minutes later, a woman in scrubs emerged from the hospital's main entrance and approached us. She was perhaps 45, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the efficient manner of someone accustomed to handling crises. "Are you Nadine Barnes?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Linda Patterson, night supervisor for patient services. Officer Martinez here explained your situation, and I spoke with Janet Kowalski about you. She left detailed notes about your case, expecting you to arrive today." Janet Kowalski. Finally, a last name to go with the voice that had become my lifeline over the past few days. "Can I see my son?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Linda's expression was carefully neutral. "Let's start by verifying your identity and getting you cleaned up." Janet left specific instructions about how to handle this situation, but it's going to require some delicate navigation. She led me into the hospital through a side entrance, past empty corridors that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax. We took an elevator to the third floor, where Linda unlocked an office marked Social Services and gestured for me to take a seat. "First things first," Linda said, settling behind a desk covered with file folders and coffee-stained papers. "I need to see identification and any documentation you have proving your relationship to Marcus Hawthorne." I dug through my backpack, pulling out the plastic bag where I'd kept my most important documents protected from the weather. My driver's license, Marcus's birth certificate listing me as his mother, his social security card, school photos from kindergarten through high school, medical records from his childhood, even a few report cards I'd saved because I was so proud of his grades. Linda examined each document carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she reached the school photos, she paused, studying them with extra attention. "These are definitely the same person," she said finally. "The Mayan facial structure, the eyes, even the way he smiles. There's no question this is the same Marcus Hawthorne we have as a patient." Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly started crying. For the first time since I'd started this journey, someone in an official capacity was acknowledging that I was exactly who I claimed to be. "However," Linda continued, and my heart sank at that word, "this creates a very complex situation. Marcus has been extremely consistent in telling everyone that both his parents are deceased. His wife, his friends, his medical team, everyone believes his mother died years ago. Introducing you into his care at this point could cause significant psychological distress." "But what if he only said that because he was angry with me?" I asked. "What if he's been hoping all these years that I'd find a way back into his life, but he was too proud to reach out first?" Linda leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Ms. Barnes, in my experience, when adult children cut contact with their parents, it's usually because they feel that relationship was harmful to their well-being. 8 years is a long time to maintain that kind of boundary. People don't usually do it lightly." The words hit like physical blows because they echoed the doubts that had haunted me throughout the walking journey. What if Marcus was better off without me? What if I'd been a worse mother than I remembered? What if this entire journey was just an elaborate way of torturing us both? "Tell me about your relationship with Marcus when he was growing up," Linda said gently. "Help me understand what might have led to this estrangement." So I told her. I told her about raising Marcus alone after his father disappeared before he was born, about working multiple jobs to keep us afloat, about the trailer park where we lived until he was 16 and I'd finally saved enough for a deposit on a small apartment. I told her about the nights I'd helped him with homework even though I was exhausted from double shifts, about the sacrifices I'd made to ensure he could participate in school activities and sports, about how proud I'd been when he became the first person in our family to attend college. "It sounds like you were a devoted mother," Linda said when I finished. "What do you think went wrong?" "I wasn't enough," I admitted, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "I wasn't educated enough, refined enough, successful enough. When Marcus got to college, when he started meeting people from different backgrounds, I think he became embarrassed by where he came from. By me. Did he tell you that directly? He didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes at his graduation ceremony. I'd worked so hard to be there, saved for months to afford the bus ticket, bought the nicest clothes I could find at Goodwill. But when I saw him with his girlfriend and her family, saw how different they were from us, I understood. I was a reminder of a life he was trying to leave behind. Linda made more notes, her expression thoughtful. Ms. Barnes, what you're describing sounds like class-based shame, which is unfortunately common when young people transition between socioeconomic levels. But that doesn't necessarily mean Marcus doesn't love you or that he's better off without you in his life. Then why hasn't he tried to contact me in 8 years? Why did he change his name? Why does he tell people I'm dead? Sometimes people create elaborate fictions to protect themselves from complicated emotions, Linda said. Telling people you're an orphan is simpler than explaining that you cut contact with your mother because you were ashamed of your background. It allows him to avoid questions and sympathy that might force him to examine his own choices. The conversation was interrupted by Linda's pager beeping urgently. She glanced at it and frowned. I need to check on something, she said, standing up. Wait here and don't go anywhere. I'll be back in a few minutes. She left me alone in the office, surrounded by the documentation of my life with Marcus. I picked up one of the school photos, a third-grade class picture where Marcus grinned at the camera with a missing front tooth and hair that refused to stay combed. He'd been so excited about that picture day, had insisted on wearing his favorite superhero t-shirt despite my attempts to dress him more formally. I remembered that little boy so clearly, the way he'd curl up next to me on the couch while I read to him, how he'd insist on helping me cook dinner, even though his help usually meant I had to clean flour off every surface in the kitchen afterward, the way he'd hold my hand when we walked through the grocery store and chatter about everything he saw. When had that loving, open child become a man who found me so shameful he'd rather pretend I was dead? Where along the way had I failed him so completely that cutting me out of his life seemed like the only option? Linda returned 20 minutes later, her expression grim. Ms. Barnes, I just spoke with Marcus's primary nurse. His condition has deteriorated significantly over the past few hours. His wife is with him now, and the medical team doesn't expect him to survive through the morning. The words hit me like a tsunami, washing away every other thought and feeling. Marcus was dying. Right now, while I sat in this office going through bureaucratic procedures, my son was slipping away from the world. I need to see him, I said, standing up so quickly that my chair fell backward. Please, I don't care if he doesn't want to see me, I don't care if it upsets him. He's my baby, and I can't let him die alone. Ms. Barnes, he's not alone. His wife Sarah has been with him constantly, and she's not his mother. The words came out as a shout, echoing off the office walls. She's known him for what, 5 years? 6? I carried him for 9 months. I raised him for 18 years. I loved him before he drew his first breath. That woman sleeping next to him doesn't know that he used to have nightmares about monsters under his bed, or that he was afraid of the dark until he was 8 years old, or that he once cried for an hour because he accidentally stepped on a snail. Linda held up her hands in a calming gesture. I understand your feelings, Ms. Barnes, but we have to consider what's best for Marcus right now. Introducing a shock into his final hours could be traumatic for everyone involved. What if it's not a shock? I asked desperately. What if somewhere deep down he's been waiting for me to come back? What if part of him has always regretted cutting me out of his life, but he was too proud or too scared to reach out? What if he's lying in that bed wishing his mother was there to hold his hand one more time? Linda was quiet for a long moment, weighing options I couldn't fully comprehend. Finally, she spoke. There might be a way to handle this that minimizes risk to everyone involved, but it would require Sarah's cooperation, and I can't guarantee she'll be willing to participate. What kind of way? We could approach Sarah first, explain the situation to her privately. Let her know that you're here, that you're Marcus's biological mother, and that you'd like the chance to see him before he dies. If she's willing to facilitate that meeting, we could proceed. If she objects, we'd have to respect her wishes as his next of kin. It wasn't the solution I wanted, but it was better than being turned away completely. How long would that take? You said he might not survive the morning. Linda glanced at her watch. It's almost 5 o'clock now. Sarah has been with him all night, and she'll probably need a break soon. When she comes out for coffee or food, I could approach her then. But Ms. Barnes, you need to understand that this conversation could go very badly. If Marcus has told Sarah that his mother is dead, learning that you're alive and here might be extremely upsetting for her. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I really did. How could I understand a situation this surreal, this emotionally complex? How could anyone prepare for a conversation where you had to convince your son's wife that you weren't actually dead? While we're waiting, let's get you cleaned up, Linda said practically. There's a shower in the staff locker room, and I can find you some clean scrubs to wear. If this meeting does happen, you'll want to look like someone who belongs in a hospital room, not like someone who's been living rough for a month. She led me down another corridor to a locker room that smelled of soap and institutional laundry detergent. The shower was small but functional, with hot water that felt like heaven against my travel-weary skin. I stood under the spray for longer than I should have, washing away 31 days of road dust and uncertainty, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever came next. The scrubs Linda had found were too big for my travel-thinned frame, but they were clean and appropriate for a hospital environment. Looking at myself in the locker room mirror, I no longer resembled a vagrant who'd wandered in from the street. I looked like someone who might legitimately have business in this place, someone who might actually be allowed near a dying patient. When I returned to Linda's office, she was on the phone, speaking in low tones that suggested the conversation was sensitive. She hung up as I entered and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. "That was Marcus's nurse," she said. "Sarah just went to the cafeteria for coffee. This might be our chance." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After 31 days of walking, after 8 years of separation, after a lifetime of wondering what had gone wrong between us, I was about to take the first step towards seeing my son again. What do I say to her? I asked. How do I explain this situation without sounding completely insane? We'll start with the truth, Linda said, gathering up my documentation and putting it in a folder. Sometimes the truth is so strange that people recognize it couldn't possibly be fabricated. We took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the palliative care unit was located. The corridor was quieter than the rest of the hospital, with softer lighting and a peaceful atmosphere that felt designed to comfort families facing loss. Room numbers passed by in a blur: 401, 403, 405, 407. Marcus was in room 409, according to the folder Linda carried. The cafeteria was on the same floor, a small space with vending machines, and a few tables where exhausted family members could grab quick meals without leaving their loved ones for long. Sarah was easy to identify. She was the only person there, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and the hollow-eyed expression of someone who'd been keeping vigil for too long. She was prettier than I'd expected, though perhaps that was unfair, since I'd only seen her under the worst possible circumstances. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the kind of expensive casual clothes that suggested comfort rather than poverty. She looked young, maybe 30, and despite her obvious exhaustion, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt her place in the world. Sarah Hawthorne? Linda approached her table with the professional manner of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Sarah looked up, her eyes immediately wary. Yes? Is something wrong with Marcus? Did something change? No, his condition is stable for now, Linda said quickly. I'm Linda Patterson from Patient Services, and I need to speak with you about a rather unusual situation that's developed. Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her and Linda sat down. I remained standing a few feet away, suddenly unsure of my role in this conversation. Mrs. Hawthorne, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound very strange, but I need you to hear me out completely before you respond, Linda began. Earlier tonight, a woman arrived at the hospital claiming to be Marcus's mother. She has extensive documentation supporting her claim, and we've verified her identity. She says she's been walking here from Oregon for the past month after receiving a letter about Marcus's condition. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked like anger. "That's impossible," she said flatly. "Marcus's parents are dead. They died in a car accident when he was 19. He's told me the story dozens of times." "I understand that's what you've been told," Linda said gently. "But the documentation this woman has provided is legitimate. Birth certificates, medical records, school photos spanning Marcus's entire childhood. There's no question that she is biologically his mother." Sarah turned to look at me directly for the first time, her gaze moving from my face to the folder Linda held, then back to my face again. "You're saying you're Marcus's mother? His real mother?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Nadine Barnes. Marcus is my son." "But that's—" Sarah shook her head, struggling to process this information. "Why would he lie about something like that? Why would he tell me you were dead if you weren't?" "We had a falling out when he was in college," I said, the words feeling inadequate to describe 8 years of separation. "He cut contact with me, changed his name, told people I was dead. I think it was easier for him than explaining the real situation." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I'd just told her. "He changed his name? From what?" "Barnes. Marcus Barnes. He took his father's surname when he started college." "His father who was never in his life," Sarah said slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Oh my God. The stories never quite made sense. He said his parents died in a car accident, but he could never remember details about the accident. He said he was raised by his grandmother, but there were never any photos of her, never any stories about their life together. When I asked questions, he'd always change the subject." Linda opened the folder and spread some of the photos across the table. School pictures, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, a visual timeline of Marcus's childhood that clearly showed him with a woman who looked exactly like the person standing in front of Sarah right now. Sarah picked up one of the photos. A shot of Marcus at maybe 10 years old, grinning as he held up a baseball trophy. I was standing behind him with my hands on his shoulders, both of us beaming at the camera. "This is really you," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "You're really his mother." "I am," I confirmed, fighting back tears. "And I know I have no right to ask this. I know this situation is impossible and complicated, and probably the last thing you want to deal with right now. But he's dying, and I've walked over 1,000 miles to get here, and I just want to see him one more time. I want to tell him I love him, even if he can't hear me, even if he doesn't want me there." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, studying the photos with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew with this new reality. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "He talks about her sometimes," she said softly, "when he's heavily medicated, when his guard is down. He mentions someone named Nady, says things like, 'Nady would know what to do,' or, 'I wish Nady was here.' I always thought he was talking about some childhood friend, or maybe a relative who died. But it was you, wasn't it? Even after all these years, even after pretending you were dead, part of him still thinks about you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus thought about me. Even drugged and dying, part of his mind still reached for his mother when he was scared or confused. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Linda interjected gently, "I know this is an overwhelming situation, but we need to make a decision quickly. Marcus's condition is very fragile, and if Ms. Barnes is going to see him, it needs to happen soon." Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Allow her to be in the room with him," Linda said. "Just for a few minutes. She understands that he may not recognize her, may not be conscious enough to respond. She just wants the chance to be present, to say goodbye. And if he is conscious, if he sees her and gets upset, what if the shock of seeing someone he believes is dead causes him to have some kind of medical crisis?" It was a valid concern, one I'd been wrestling with throughout this entire journey. What if my presence caused Marcus more pain in his final hours? What if I was being selfish, prioritizing my own need for closure over his comfort and peace? "I'll leave immediately if he seems distressed," I said. "I won't stay if my being there makes things worse for him. I just need to try. I need to know that I did everything possible to be there for him when he needed me most." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, and I saw her weighing the decision that would determine whether I'd see my son again, or spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. "He never stopped loving you," she said finally. "I can see it now, looking back. The way he'd go quiet on Mother's Day, the way he'd sometimes stare at families in restaurants with that sad expression. I always thought he was missing his dead parents, but he was missing you, wasn't he? He was missing his living mother who he'd convinced himself he didn't need." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without breaking down completely. "All right," Sarah said, standing up from the table. "You can see him. But I have conditions. I'll be in the room the entire time, and if I think your presence is causing him distress, you'll need to leave immediately. And regardless of what happens, this stays between us. I won't have him spending his final hours dealing with explanations or justifications or complicated family drama." "I understand," I said, relief flooding through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." "I think I do," Sarah said softly. "I'm a mother too. If something happened to my relationship with my child, if years passed and I found myself in your situation, I'd want someone to show me the same mercy I'm showing you." The walk from the cafeteria to room 409 felt both endless and too short. My heart was pounding so hard I wondered if the cardiac monitors in the hallway might pick up the rhythm. After 8 years of wondering, after 31 days of walking, after a lifetime of loving someone who'd tried to erase me from his existence, I was about to see Marcus again. Sarah paused outside his door, her hand on the handle. "He's been unconscious for most of the night," she said quietly. "The medication keeps him comfortable, but he drifts in and out. If he does wake up while you're here, remember that he's very weak and disoriented. Don't expect him to be the person you remember." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I expected at this point. The Marcus I remembered was an 18-year-old boy heading off to college, with dreams and ambitions and love for the mother who'd raised him. The Marcus behind this door was a dying man who'd spent 8 years building a life that specifically excluded me. Sarah opened the door, and I followed her into the room where my son lay dying. The first thing that struck me wasn't how different Marcus looked, though 8 years and terminal illness had certainly changed him. It was how much he still resembled the little boy I'd raised. Even pale and gaunt, even with medical equipment surrounding his bed like mechanical guardians, I could see echoes of the child who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. His dark hair, now longer than he'd worn it in college, fell across his forehead in the same unruly way it had when he was 8 years old, and refused to let me comb it properly. His hands, resting on top of the white hospital blanket, were the same elegant fingers that had learned to tie his shoes by watching me demonstrate the motion dozens of times on the living room floor of our tiny apartment. But it was his face that broke my heart. Even unconscious, even relaxed by whatever medications were keeping him comfortable, there was a tension around his eyes that spoke of pain beyond the physical. This was a man who'd been carrying emotional weight for years, and now that weight was etched permanently into the features I'd memorized during 18 years of loving him. Sarah moved to the chair beside his bed with the practiced ease of someone who'd been maintaining this vigil for days. She reached for his hand automatically, her thumb tracing gentle circles across his knuckles, in a gesture so intimate and tender that I felt like an intruder witnessing it. "I usually talk to him," she said quietly, not looking away from Marcus's face. "The nurses say he might be able to hear us even when he seems unconscious. I tell him about my day, about the calls from friends, about what's happening outside. Normal things." I remained standing near the foot of the bed, afraid to move closer without explicit permission. The room felt sacred in a way I hadn't expected, like a church where prayers were being offered for a soul preparing to depart. The steady beep of monitors provided a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to emphasize how fragile his hold on life had become. "How long has he been like this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 days since he last spoke clearly," Sarah replied. "A week since he was really himself. The progression has been faster than anyone expected. 2 months ago, he was still working, still making plans for treatment. Then everything just accelerated. I absorbed this information like physical blows. 2 months ago, while I was fixing engines and living my quiet life in Oregon, Marcus had been receiving a death sentence. 2 months of knowing he was dying, 2 months of facing his mortality, and through all of it he'd maintained the fiction that his mother was already gone. Did he ever talk about me? The question slipped out before I could stop myself, and I immediately regretted asking. Sarah was being generous enough to allow me this time with him. Pressing her for details about his private thoughts felt like taking advantage. But Sarah considered the question seriously, her gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "Not directly," she said finally, "but there were moments, especially in the beginning when we first started dating, when I'd catch him looking at older women in restaurants or stores with this wistful expression. When I asked about it, he'd always change the subject." She paused, stroking his hand with the unconscious tenderness of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He never wanted to celebrate Mother's Day, said it was a commercial holiday, meaningless and manipulative. But every May, he'd get quiet and distant for the entire week. I learned not to plan anything important during that time. The revelation that Marcus struggled with Mother's Day gave me a strange comfort. It meant that even while telling the world I was dead, part of him still marked the day that was supposed to celebrate our relationship. Even while building a life that excluded me, he couldn't completely eliminate the space I'd once occupied. "And his birthday," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful quality. "He always insisted we keep celebrations small, just the two of us. Said he didn't like being the center of attention, but I think it was because birthdays reminded him of his childhood, of parties with someone who isn't supposed to exist anymore. I remembered those birthday parties with vivid clarity, small affairs in our cramped apartment, just the two of us and whatever friends from school Marcus wanted to invite. I'd stretch our grocery budget to afford ingredients for homemade cake, and we'd spend hours decorating it together, Marcus more interested in eating the frosting than creating anything aesthetically pleasing. He'd blow out his candles and make elaborate wishes that he'd whisper to me later when we were cleaning up. What did he wish for? I'd ask every year, knowing he wasn't supposed to tell me but hoping he would anyway. And every year until he turned 13, he'd lean close and whisper some variation of, "I wish that we could always be this happy, just me and you." Now he was dying in a room where I wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by the life he'd built, after deciding that me and you wasn't enough anymore. The sound of Marcus stirring brought me back to the present. His eyelids fluttered, and his breathing pattern changed from the deep rhythm of unconsciousness to something more irregular. Sarah immediately leaned forward, her hand tightening around his. "Marcus, can you hear me, sweetheart?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually settling on Sarah's face. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse and weak, barely recognizable as the confident tone I remembered from his childhood. "Sarah, how long was I out?" "A few hours," she said gently. "You're okay?" "I'm right here." Marcus's gaze drifted around the room, taking in the familiar medical equipment, the flowers on the windowsill, the cards and photos Sarah had arranged to make the space feel more personal. Then his eyes found me standing at the foot of his bed, and his entire body went rigid. For a moment that felt like hours, we simply stared at each other. I watched recognition dawn in his eyes, watched confusion replace drowsiness, watched his face cycle through emotions I couldn't identify. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again, as if his mind couldn't produce words for what he was seeing. "Mom?" The word came out as barely a breath, so quiet I almost wasn't sure he'd said it. "Hello, Marcus," I managed to say, my voice thick with 8 years of accumulated emotion. He blinked several times, and I could see him struggling to process whether what he was seeing was real or some medication-induced hallucination. His hand moved restlessly on the blanket, and Sarah caught it in both of hers, anchoring him to reality. "She's real," Sarah said softly. "She's really here." "But you're—" Marcus's voice trailed off, and he looked from me to Sarah and back again, his expression a mixture of wonder and something that might have been fear. "You're supposed to be dead." The words hung in the air between us like an accusation. He'd said them without malice, more as a statement of confusion than anger, but they carried the weight of 8 years of deliberate separation. "I'm very much alive," I said, taking a small step closer to the bed. I've been alive this whole time, Marcus. I never went anywhere." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I don't understand. Sarah, I don't understand what's happening." Sarah looked at me with an expression that clearly said this was my moment to explain, but how do you summarize 8 years of estrangement in words that won't overwhelm a dying man? How do you explain to your son that you've been grieving him while he's been pretending you don't exist? "I got a letter from the hospital," I said, keeping my voice as gentle as possible. "About your diagnosis. I came as soon as I could." "A letter?" Marcus looked confused. "But I told them I don't have any family. I told them my parents were dead." "The hospital has ways of finding people," I said. "Legal next of kin notifications, public records. They found me, even though you'd changed your name." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just my presence but the implications of everything I'd just said. "You know about the name change. I know about all of it, sweetheart. The graduation ceremony, the returned letters, the 8 years of silence. I know you've been telling people I'm dead." His face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology hit me like a physical force, and I found myself moving closer to the bed without conscious thought. "Marcus, you don't need to apologize. Not now, not when you're—" "But I do," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength even as his body remained weak. "I do need to apologize. What I did to you, what I put you through, it was unforgivable." Sarah reached for tissues from the bedside table, gently wiping his face while shooting me a look that seemed to ask whether this conversation was what I'd hoped for or something I needed to stop before it went too far. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" I said, moving to the other side of the bed so I could see his face more clearly. "Help me understand what went wrong between us." Marcus took a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the ceiling as if looking into the past. "Do you remember my graduation? From college?" "Of course I remember. I was so proud of you. I'd worked extra shifts for months to afford the bus ticket to get there." "I was proud too," he said quietly, "until I saw you." The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "Catherine's parents were there," he said, referring to the girlfriend I'd glimpsed that day. "Her father was a surgeon, her mother was a professor. They wore expensive clothes and talked about wine regions and summer houses. And then there was my mom, in her Goodwill dress with grease under her fingernails, and I was ashamed." He turned to look at me directly, his eyes filled with pain that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "I was ashamed of you, Mom. Ashamed of where I came from, ashamed of our apartment and your jobs, and the fact that you looked like someone who worked with her hands for a living." The honesty was brutal, but there was also relief in finally hearing the truth I'd suspected for 8 years. "And you thought your life would be easier without me in it." "I thought Catherine's life would be easier without you in it," he corrected. "I thought if I could just erase my background, if I could start fresh as someone who came from nowhere instead of somewhere embarrassing, then I could fit into her world." "Did it work?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "For a while. Catherine and I lasted another year after graduation. But eventually she figured out that I was hiding something, that my stories about my family never quite added up. When she confronted me about it, I told her the truth. All of it. And she left me that same day. Said she couldn't be with someone who was ashamed of his own mother, someone who would lie about something so fundamental. Said it revealed a character flaw she couldn't overlook. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Marcus had sacrificed his relationship with me to preserve his relationship with Catherine, only to lose Catherine because of how he'd treated me. "But you kept the story going," I observed. "Even after Catherine left, you continued telling people I was dead." "Because by then it was easier than admitting what I'd done," he said, his voice barely audible. "How do you explain to new friends, to Sarah, that you've been lying about your mother being dead? How do you introduce them to a woman you've been pretending doesn't exist for years?" Sarah squeezed his hand tighter. "You could have told me the truth, Marcus. I would have understood." "Would you have?" he asked, turning to look at her. "If I'd told you on our first date that I came from a trailer park, that my mother was a mechanic who never finished high school, That I'd cut contact with her because I was embarrassed by my background? Would you still have wanted to get to know me? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could see her honestly considering the question. I don't know, she admitted finally. I might have judged you for cutting contact with your family. But I would have wanted to hear your side of the story. And I was too scared to take that risk, Marcus said. It seemed safer to stick with the orphan story. Clean, simple, no complicated family dynamics to navigate. Except I wasn't actually dead, I pointed out gently. I was alive and missing you and wondering every day what I'd done wrong. Fresh tears spilled down Marcus's cheeks. I know. God, Mom, I know. There were so many times I almost called you. Birthdays, holidays, when I got promoted at work, when Sarah and I got married. But too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap I'd created. You could have just called, I said simply. Any time in the past 8 years, you could have just picked up the phone. I was too proud, he admitted. Too ashamed of what I'd done. Too scared that you'd reject me the way I'd rejected you. It seemed easier to let sleeping dogs lie. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A nurse peered in, her expression apologetic but firm. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to check Mr. Hawthorne's vitals and adjust his medication. Could I have just a moment? Sarah and I stepped back while the nurse worked efficiently around Marcus's bed, checking monitors and making notes on his chart. When she finished, she gave us a gentle smile that somehow conveyed both sympathy and a subtle warning about not overtaxing the patient. Try to keep visits brief, she said quietly to Sarah as she headed for the door. His energy levels are very limited right now. When we were alone again, Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How did you get here, Mom? The hospital said you called from Oregon. I drove part way, then my car broke down. So I walked the rest. His eyes widened. You walked? From where? Colorado. About 1,000 miles, give or take. You walked 1,000 miles to get here? His voice was filled with disbelief. Why would you do that? The question seemed so obvious that I wasn't sure how to answer it. Because you're my son, I said finally. Because I love you, and you were dying, and I couldn't afford a plane ticket. Because after 8 years of wondering if you were okay, I finally had a reason to find out. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd just told him. You walked across the country because you got a letter saying I was sick. I walked across the country because I got a letter saying my son was dying, and despite everything that's happened between us, I couldn't let you die thinking your mother didn't care about you. But I told everyone you were dead, he said, his voice breaking. I convinced everyone, including myself most of the time, that you didn't exist. How could you still care about someone who erased you from his life? Because love doesn't work that way, I said, moving closer to his bed again. You can't just turn it off because someone hurts you. You can't stop being someone's mother because they stop being your son. I've spent 8 years missing you, worrying about you, wondering if you were happy and healthy, and finding what you were looking for in life. I wasn't, he said quietly. Happy, I mean. I was successful, I had a good career, and a beautiful wife and all the trappings of the life I thought I wanted. But I was never really happy. Sarah's expression suggested this wasn't news to her, and I wondered how many conversations they'd had about the sadness Marcus carried, despite his outward success. There was always something missing, he continued, some part of me that felt incomplete. I told myself it was because I was an orphan, because I'd lost my parents young and never had the chance to form adult relationships with them. But it wasn't that, was it? It was because I'd thrown away the most important relationship in my life because I was too shallow and stupid to appreciate what I had. Marcus, you are 22 years old, I said gently. 22-year-olds make terrible decisions all the time. They're supposed to make terrible decisions. That's how they learn who they want to be. But most 22-year-olds don't spend the next 8 years doubling down on their terrible decisions, he replied bitterly. Most of them eventually grow up and make amends. Some do, I said, some don't. Some get so deep into a lie that they can't find their way back to the truth. Is that what happened to me? I considered the question seriously. I think you got scared. I think once you'd told Catherine the first was dead, once you'd started building a life based on that story, it became too risky to admit you'd been lying. And the longer it went on, the bigger the lie became, until it seemed impossible to unravel. Marcus nodded slowly. That's exactly what happened. Every time I thought about calling you, I'd remember all the people I'd lied to, all the stories I'd have to recant, all the questions I'd have to answer. It seemed easier to stick with the fiction. Even when you got sick? Even when you were facing something this serious, you didn't think about reaching out? Especially then, he said. When I got the diagnosis, when the doctors started talking about prognosis and treatment options, all I could think about was how much I wanted my mother. But I'd spent so many years convincing everyone that my mother was dead that I couldn't figure out how to bring her back to life. The admission broke something open in my chest, and I found myself reaching for his hand before I could think about whether it was appropriate. His fingers closed around mine with surprising strength, and for a moment we were just a mother and son holding hands in a hospital room, the way we should have been doing for the past 8 years. I wanted to call you so many times, he whispered. Especially after we got married, when Sarah would talk about having kids someday, and I'd think about what kind of grandmother you would be. I wanted to tell her about you, about how you used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and how you taught me to change a tire when I was 12. But I'd painted myself into a corner with so many lies that I didn't know how to find my way back to the truth. Sarah listened to this with tears in her eyes, and I realized she was grieving too, not just for the husband she was about to lose, but for the relationship she'd been denied, for the mother-in-law she'd never known she had, for the family connections that had been severed by fear and pride. I could have been there for you, I said, my own tears flowing freely now. During the diagnosis, during the treatment planning, during all of this, you didn't have to face it alone. I wasn't alone, Marcus said, squeezing Sarah's hand. Sarah has been incredible through all of this. But you're right, I could have had both of you. I could have had my wife and my mother supporting me through the hardest thing I've ever faced. Instead, I chose to maintain a lie that served no one. The conversation was taking a toll on his energy. I could see exhaustion creeping back into his features despite the emotional intensity of our reunion. But there were still things that needed to be said, questions that had been 8 years in the making. Do you remember the day you graduated from college? I asked. Do you remember what I was wearing? Marcus smiled weakly. A blue dress with flowers on it, and a jacket that didn't quite match, but you'd tried to coordinate them. You looked so proud, Mom. I'll never forget the expression on your face when they called my name. I was proud. I was the proudest mother in that entire auditorium. I didn't care what anyone else thought about my clothes, or my background, or whether I belonged there. I only cared that my son, the little boy I'd raised by myself, was about to become the first person in our family to earn a college degree. I know, he said quietly. I could see it in your face. And that made it worse somehow, seeing how much you loved me while I was busy being ashamed of you. And when you walked away from me that day, when you pretended not to see me calling your name, do you know what I thought? Marcus shook his head, though his expression suggested he might not want to hear the answer. I thought I must have done something wrong. I thought maybe I'd embarrassed you somehow. Maybe I'd said the wrong thing, or been too enthusiastic, or not understood the social protocols of a college graduation. I spent the entire bus ride home replaying every moment of that day, trying to figure out what I'd done to make you turn away from me. You didn't do anything wrong, Marcus said firmly. Mom, you didn't do a single thing wrong. Everything you did that day, everything you'd done for the previous 22 years, was perfect. The problem was entirely with me. I know that now, I said. But I didn't know it then. I spent years wondering if I'd failed you somehow, if there was something I should have done differently when you were growing up. You were the best mother anyone could ask for, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. You worked yourself to exhaustion to give me opportunities you'd never had. You sacrificed everything so I could have a better life than you'd had. And I repaid that by being embarrassed of you in front of people who weren't worthy to shine your shoes. The words were healing balm on wounds I'd carried for 8 years, but they also made me aware of how much time we'd lost. How many conversations we should have had, how many moments of connection had been sacrificed to pride and fear. "Marcus," I said gently, "I need you to know that I forgive you. For all of it. For the graduation day. For changing your name. For the years of silence. For telling people I was dead. I understand why you did it, and I forgive you completely." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "Forgiveness isn't about what people deserve," I replied. "It's about what we choose to give because we love them. And I've never stopped loving you, not for a single day in 8 years." "I love you too, Mom," he whispered. "I've never stopped loving you either, even when I was pretending you didn't exist. Especially then." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us crying, both of us trying to absorb the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that couldn't be unsaid. 8 years of separation couldn't be healed in a single conversation, but we'd made a start. Sarah had been mostly quiet during our exchange, but now she spoke up. "Marcus, there's something else we need to talk about. Something I haven't told you yet." Marcus turned to look at his wife, his expression curious but wary. "What is it?" Sarah glanced at me, then back at Marcus, and I could see her weighing how much emotional intensity he could handle in one conversation. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Marcus stared at his wife in shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I felt my own breath catch, the implications of this news cascading through my mind like dominoes falling. "Pregnant?" Marcus finally managed. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks, Sarah said. "I was waiting for the right time to tell you, but there hasn't been a right time. And now, with your mother here, with everything that's happening, I thought you should know." Marcus closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his cancer. "A baby," he said softly. "We're going to have a baby, and I'm never going to meet him." "Her," Sarah corrected gently. "It's too early to know for sure, but I have a feeling it's a girl." "A granddaughter," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in my mouth. "I'm going to have a granddaughter." Marcus looked at me with an expression that was equal parts joy and devastation. "You're going to be a grandmother, Mom, the grandmother I never thought you'd have the chance to be." The reality of the situation settled over all of us like a heavy blanket. Marcus was dying, but his child was being born. Sarah would be raising that child without her father, but she wouldn't be raising her without family. I would be a grandmother to a child whose father had spent years pretending I didn't exist. "What are you going to tell her about me?" Marcus asked Sarah, his voice barely audible. "What are you going to tell our daughter about her grandfather?" Sarah reached for his hand again, her own tears flowing freely now. "I'm going to tell her the truth. About how much you loved her before you ever met her. About how excited you were when we talked about having children. About what a good man you were despite the mistakes you made." "And about his mother?" I asked quietly. "What will you tell her about me?" Sarah turned to look at me, and I could see her making a decision that would shape my relationship with my granddaughter for years to come. "I'm going to tell her about the grandmother who walked across the country to say goodbye to her son," she said. "About the woman who never stopped loving him even when he made it impossible for her to be in his life. About the mechanic from Oregon, who raised a brilliant, successful man all by herself and deserves to know her grandchild." The generosity of this offer overwhelmed me. After 8 years of separation, after 31 days of walking toward an uncertain reunion, I was being welcomed not just back into Marcus's life, but into the life of the family he was leaving behind. "I'd like that," I said through my tears. "I'd like to be part of her life if you'll let me." "I need you to be part of her life," Sarah said firmly. "She's going to grow up without her father, but she doesn't have to grow up without knowing where she came from. She doesn't have to wonder about her family history the way Marcus did after he cut contact with you." Marcus was listening to this conversation with an expression of wonder mixed with grief. "You two would do that? You'd stay in touch after I'm gone?" "If Sarah's willing," I said, looking at my daughter-in-law with gratitude I couldn't adequately express. "I'd like to be the kind of grandmother who sends birthday cards and Christmas presents and calls to check on bedtime stories." "I'm counting on it," Sarah said. This baby is going to need all the love and family connection she can get. The nurse returned then, her expression apologetic, but firm. I'm sorry, but Mr. Hawthorne really needs to rest now. His vitals are showing signs of fatigue, and we need to be careful not to overtax him. I looked at Marcus, memorizing his face, trying to absorb every detail of this moment that had been 8 years in the making. Should I go? I asked. I can come back tomorrow if you want me to. Don't go, Marcus said quickly, reaching for my hand again. Please don't go, Mom. I know I don't deserve it after everything I've put you through, but I don't want to be alone tonight. You won't be alone, I promised, settling into the chair on the opposite side of his bed from Sarah. I'm not going anywhere. As Marcus drifted back into medicated sleep, Sarah and I set vigil together, 2 women who loved the same man, watching over him as his body prepared to let go of life. We talked quietly about the granddaughter who would never meet her grandfather, about the stories we'd tell her, about the ways we'd keep Marcus's memory alive for a child who would carry his genes but not his presence. And in the quiet darkness of that hospital room, with machines humming their mechanical lullabies and my son breathing slowly beside us, I realized that this journey had given me more than I'd dared hope for. I'd walked across 5 states to say goodbye to Marcus, but I'd also found my way into a new family, a new purpose, a new chapter of life that would begin just as my son's was ending. The forgiveness we'd exchanged couldn't erase 8 years of separation, but it could heal the wounds that had kept us apart. And the love we'd rediscovered in that hospital room would live on in the granddaughter I was about to meet, carried forward by 2 women who understood that family connections are too precious to be abandoned, no matter how complicated they become. Marcus slipped away peacefully at dawn on November 3rd, while Sarah held one hand and I held the other. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words of wisdom, or movie-perfect goodbye. One breath simply didn't follow the previous one, and the son I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years, and mourned for 8 more was gone. The silence that followed felt different from any quiet I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something else entirely, something that filled the space where Marcus's breathing had been just moments before. Sarah's soft crying provided a gentle soundtrack to those first minutes of his absence, but even her grief felt hushed, reverent, as if we were in the presence of something sacred. I didn't cry immediately. Instead, I found myself studying Marcus's face, noting how the lines of pain had smoothed away, how he looked younger somehow, more like the boy I remembered than the man he'd become. Death had given him back something that illness and time had taken away, a piece that had been missing from his features for longer than I'd realized. He looks so calm, Sarah whispered, her thumb still tracing gentle circles across his knuckles even though he could no longer feel her touch. He always looked peaceful when he slept, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I'd expected. Even as a little boy, even when he'd fought bedtime for hours, once he finally fell asleep, he'd look like an angel. We sat with him for another hour before the nurse came to officially record the time of death and begin the process of transitioning Marcus from patient to memory. During those quiet minutes, Sarah and I didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. We were 2 women saying goodbye to the most important person in our respective worlds, and words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what we were experiencing. When the medical staff finally arrived, they moved with the respectful efficiency of people who understood that death was both a clinical event and a profound human moment. They asked gentle questions about funeral arrangements and next of kin notifications, topics that reminded me how complicated Marcus's death would be for all the people who'd believed his mother was already gone. What do we tell people? Sarah asked as we stood in the hospital parking lot 2 hours later, both of us blinking in the autumn sunlight like creatures emerging from a cave. His coworkers are friends, everyone who's been sending sympathy cards because they thought he was facing this alone? It was a practical question that highlighted just how complex the web of deception had become. Marcus's death would require not just grief and funeral planning, but also a careful untangling of 8 years of constructed mythology. We tell them the truth, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what that would look like in practice. We tell them that families are complicated, that people sometimes make choices they later regret, and that love doesn't always follow the neat patterns we expect it to. Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she was still processing the logistics of rewriting Marcus's history for public consumption. The funeral home is going to ask about surviving family members for the obituary. How do I explain that his mother, who's been listed as deceased for years, is actually very much alive and standing right here? We'll figure it out together, I said, surprised by how natural it felt to include myself in Sarah's future planning. None of this has to be perfect or completely explained to everyone's satisfaction. People will understand that there were private family matters that don't need to be aired publicly. We drove to Sarah's house in separate cars, mine a rental I'd picked up at the hospital's recommendation, hers the sedan she'd been using for daily trips back and forth between home and Marcus's bedside. Following her through the Richmond suburbs felt surreal, like I was being led into a life that had existed parallel to my own for years without my knowledge. The house Marcus and Sarah shared was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like what I'd imagined. It was a modest two-story colonial in a neighborhood of young professionals, with a well-maintained lawn and the kind of architectural details that suggested comfort rather than ostentation. This wasn't the mansion I'd sometimes pictured when I wondered about Marcus's success, but it also wasn't the cramped apartment where he'd grown up. It was something in between, something that spoke of steady progress and reasonable ambitions. He loved this house, Sarah said as we stood in the driveway, both of us staring at the front door as if it might provide answers to questions we didn't know how to ask. We bought it 3 years ago, right after we got married. He spent months researching neighborhoods and mortgage rates, determined to make the smartest possible decision. I could picture Marcus doing exactly that, approaching homeownership with the same methodical precision he'd brought to his college applications and career planning. He'd always been a boy who made lists and researched options, who wanted to understand every angle before committing to anything important. Did he ever talk about the house where he grew up? I asked, curious whether any memories of our tiny apartment had survived his reinvention. Sometimes, Sarah said, pulling keys from her purse but not immediately using them. He'd mention wanting more space than he'd had as a child, wanting a yard where kids could play safely, but he never went into details about where exactly he'd lived before. We went inside together, and I found myself in the strange position of being a guest in a home that my son had shared with his wife, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd been excluded from but had helped make possible. The furniture was nice but not extravagant, the kind of pieces young couples buy when they're building a life together on 2 professional incomes. Family photos covered the mantelpiece and side tables, but they were all recent, all from Marcus's adult life after he'd erased his childhood. I keep thinking I should feel more angry, Sarah said, settling onto the couch and gesturing for me to join her. About the lies, about the 8 years of believing he was essentially an orphan. But mostly I just feel sad for all the time we lost. I understood exactly what she meant. The anger would probably come later, in waves, as the full impact of Marcus's deception settled into our daily reality. But right now, with his death still fresh and raw, grief was taking up all the emotional space that anger might otherwise occupy. He was protecting himself, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to comfort Sarah or convince myself. It probably started as a way to avoid uncomfortable questions about his background, and then became something he couldn't figure out how to undo without revealing how long he'd been lying. But the lies hurt you too, Sarah pointed out. 8 years of thinking your son was ashamed of you, 8 years of wondering if you'd failed as a mother. That's not fair, regardless of what he was trying to protect himself from. She was right, of course. Marcus's decision to erase me from his narrative had protected him from embarrassment and difficult conversations, but it had caused me years of self-doubt and heartache. The love that had driven me to walk across 5 states to reach him had also sustained me through nearly a decade of wondering what I'd done wrong. Forgiveness isn't about fairness, I said, echoing words I'd spoken in Marcus's hospital room. It's about choosing love over resentment, understanding over judgment. I can acknowledge that Marcus hurt me deeply while still accepting that he was doing the best he could with the emotional tools he had at the time. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, and I could see her processing this perspective alongside her own feelings about being married to someone who'd maintained such an elaborate fiction about his past. I think I'm going to need time to get there, she said finally. To the forgiveness part, I mean. Right now I'm too sad and too overwhelmed to sort through all the complicated feelings about the lies. That's completely normal, I assured her. Grief doesn't follow a timeline, and neither does forgiveness. You'll process this at whatever pace feels right for you. The afternoon dissolved into practical tasks that kept us busy without requiring too much emotional energy. We called the funeral home and began planning a service that would honor Marcus's life without delving too deeply into the complexities of his family situation. We sorted through his clothes and personal belongings, Sarah keeping some items for sentimental value and setting others aside for donation. We made lists of people who needed to be notified about his death, a process that revealed just how thoroughly Marcus had compartmentalized different aspects of his life. As evening approached, Sarah began showing signs of the exhaustion that comes after sustained grief and stress. She'd been living at the hospital for weeks, functioning on adrenaline and determination, and Marcus's death had removed the urgent purpose that had been sustaining her. "Why don't you get some rest?" I suggested. "I can handle dinner, maybe start working on the obituary draft if you want." "You don't have to do that," Sarah said, though her protest lacked conviction. "You've been through just as much as I have today." "I've been through 31 days of walking toward this moment," I corrected gently. "Today was hard, but it was also what I came here for. Let me help with the practical things while you process the emotional ones." Sarah agreed, disappearing upstairs for a nap while I familiarized myself with the kitchen where my son had eaten his last home-cooked meals. The refrigerator was nearly empty, evidence of weeks spent at the hospital, but I found enough ingredients to make a simple pasta dish that would provide comfort without requiring much energy to eat. While the water boiled, I explored the house more thoroughly, looking for traces of the boy I'd raised and the man Marcus had become. His home office revealed the most about his personality. Organized bookshelves filled with architecture texts and design magazines, a drafting table covered with sketches of buildings that would never be constructed, framed photographs of structures he'd helped design during his professional career. One photo in particular caught my attention. A small apartment building with clean lines and plenty of windows, designed in a style that prioritized natural light and efficient use of space. The plaque at the bottom identified it as low-income housing in Portland, completed 2 years earlier. Marcus had spent his career designing buildings, but this particular project suggested he'd never completely forgotten where he came from, even while pretending his origins didn't exist. I was still studying the photograph when Sarah came downstairs, looking slightly more rested but carrying a manila folder that suggested she'd been thinking rather than sleeping. "I found this in Marcus's desk," she said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. "I think you should see what's inside." The folder contained a collection of newspaper clippings, printouts from online searches, and what appeared to be private investigator reports. All of them were about me. Marcus had been keeping track of my life for the past 8 years, documenting my job promotions, my address changes, even my brief relationship with Robert. The most recent entry was from 6 months ago, a report confirming that I was still employed at the auto shop in Oregon and still living alone. "He never stopped caring about you," Sarah said as I flipped through page after page of evidence that I'd been on Marcus's mind throughout our separation. "He might have told everyone you were dead, but he was making sure you were alive and okay." The revelation was overwhelming. While I'd been wondering whether Marcus ever thought about me, he'd been actively monitoring my life from a distance, ensuring that his mother was safe and healthy even while maintaining the fiction that she didn't exist. It was both comforting and heartbreaking, evidence of love constrained by pride and circumstance. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a report dated 3 years earlier. "He hired someone to confirm that you were doing well after Robert moved out. The investigator noted that you seemed to be maintaining independence and emotional stability following the end of a long-term relationship." I remembered the period she was referring to, the months after Robert and I had decided we weren't compatible long-term. I'd been sad but not devastated, disappointed but not broken. It had never occurred to me that my son might be keeping track of my romantic life from across the country. "Why didn't he ever reach out?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. If he cared enough to hire investigators, if he was worried about my well-being, why not just call? "Because he'd painted himself into a corner with the lies," Sarah said. "How do you call someone you've spent years telling people is dead? How do you explain to your wife that you've been secretly monitoring your mother's life while claiming you don't have any family?" The folder also contained drafts of letters Marcus had apparently written, but never sent. Pages and pages of attempts to explain himself, to apologize, to find a way back into my life that wouldn't require admitting to years of deception. The letters revealed a man torn between love and shame, desperate to reconnect but terrified of the consequences. One letter, dated just 6 months before his diagnosis, was particularly revealing. Dear Mom, I know I don't have the right to call you that anymore, and I know this letter is about 8 years too late, but I think about you every single day. I think about the way you used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and how you taught me to change a tire in the parking lot behind our apartment, and how proud you looked at my high school graduation, even though you were exhausted from working a double shift. I think about how I threw all of that away because I was too immature and too shallow to appreciate what I had. I've built a good life here, but it's not a complete life, because it doesn't include the person who made all of it possible. I don't know how to fix what I broke between us, but I want you to know that not a day goes by when I don't regret the choices I made. I love you, and I miss you, and I'm sorry for being too proud to pick up the phone and tell you that. Your son, Marcus. Reading his words was like receiving a message from beyond the grave, confirmation that the love I'd carried for 8 years had been reciprocated even when it couldn't be expressed. Marcus had been as trapped by his lies as I'd been hurt by them, wanting to reconnect but unable to find a path back to honesty. He was going to send that one, Sarah said quietly. He showed it to me about a month before he got sick, asked what I thought about him reaching out to a relative he'd lost touch with. I encouraged him to make the call, but then the diagnosis came, and everything else took priority. The timing was cruel, but not surprising. Marcus had finally worked up the courage to contact me just as cancer entered his life and changed everything. The illness that had ultimately brought us back together had also prevented him from reaching out on his own terms, from healing our relationship while he was still healthy enough to enjoy the reconciliation. We spent the evening reading through the rest of the folder, piecing together Marcus's emotional journey over the 8 years we'd been separated. The private investigator reports painted a picture of a man who'd never stopped loving his mother but had trapped himself in a web of lies that seemed impossible to escape. The unsent letters revealed someone who'd grown increasingly desperate to reconnect as the years passed, but had been paralyzed by shame and fear of rejection. I wish he'd been brave enough to send just one of these letters, I said as we reached the bottom of the pile. Any one of them would have opened the door to healing years earlier. But then you wouldn't have had this experience, Sarah pointed out. Walking across the country, showing up at his bedside, proving that maternal love can overcome any obstacle. Maybe this was the reunion you were both meant to have. I wasn't sure I believed in that kind of predetermined destiny, but I appreciated Sarah's attempt to find meaning in the painful timing of our reconciliation. Perhaps there was something powerful about love that had survived 8 years of separation and a 1,000-mile journey on foot. Perhaps the strength required to overcome those obstacles had made our final conversation more meaningful than it would have been under easier circumstances. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral planning and administrative tasks. Sarah and I developed an efficient partnership, dividing responsibilities according to our strengths, and supporting each other through the complicated process of memorializing someone whose life story was more complex than most people realized. The obituary presented the biggest challenge. How do you summarize the life of someone who'd spent years creating an elaborate fiction about his family? How do you honor his memory while acknowledging the existence of people he'd pretended were dead? We settled on language that was honest without being sensational. Marcus Hawthorne, 28, died peacefully on November 3rd after a courageous battle with pancreatic cancer. He is survived by his wife Sarah and his mother Nadine Barnes of Oregon. Due to family circumstances, services will be private. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the American Cancer Society. The phrasing acknowledged my existence without going into details about our estrangement, allowing people to draw their own conclusions about the family circumstances that had kept us apart. It wasn't perfect, but it was truthful enough to honor Marcus's memory while protecting everyone involved from having to explain the full complexity of our relationship. The funeral itself was small, attended by perhaps 30 people who'd been part of Marcus and Sarah's life in Richmond. I sat in the front row beside my daughter-in-law, surrounded by people who'd known Marcus as an orphan, and were now trying to process the revelation that his mother was very much alive and present. Several people approached me afterward with expressions of confusion and curiosity, but Sarah had clearly briefed everyone in advance about not asking intrusive questions. The conversations were polite and sympathetic, focused on Marcus's positive qualities, rather than the mysterious family circumstances that had kept us separated. He was a good man, one of his coworkers told me, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. Whatever happened between you two in the past, I hope you know that he spoke very fondly of his childhood, whenever he did mention it. The comment surprised me, since I'd assumed Marcus never talked about his early life, but as the afternoon progressed, I heard similar sentiments from several other people. Apparently, while Marcus had been careful not to reveal specific details about his background, he had occasionally shared positive memories from his youth. People remembered him talking about learning to cook from someone who was patient with his mistakes, about camping trips that had instilled a love of nature, about feeling supported and encouraged in his academic pursuits. He'd found a way to honor our relationship while maintaining his fiction, sharing the good memories while protecting himself from questions about why those relationships had ended. It was another layer of complexity to his 8-year deception, evidence that his love for me had never completely disappeared even while he was denying my existence. After the service, Sarah and I returned to the house to begin the process of sorting through condolence cards and planning for the future. The reality of Marcus's absence was beginning to settle in, the sharp pain of fresh grief giving way to the duller ache of permanent loss. "I keep expecting him to walk through the door," Sarah said as we sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and a pile of sympathy cards. "Or to hear his key in the lock when I'm upstairs. The house feels too quiet without him." I understood exactly what she meant. The silence was different from the peaceful quiet we'd shared during Marcus's final hours. This was the silence of absence, the acoustic void left by someone who would never again contribute sound to these rooms. "That feeling will fade eventually," I said, drawing on memories of losing my own parents years earlier. "Not completely, but it becomes less sharp. You'll stop listening for sounds that will never come." "How long does it take?" "It's different for everyone. Grief doesn't follow a schedule or respect timelines. But one day you'll realize you've gone an entire morning without expecting to see him, and that will feel like both progress and loss at the same time." Sarah nodded, absently touching her still flat belly where Marcus's daughter was growing. "I worry about raising her alone, about making all the important decisions without his input, about whether I'll be enough for her by myself." "You won't be by yourself," I reminded her. "You'll have me if you want me. And you'll have all the love and wisdom Marcus would have given her, passed along through the stories you tell and the values you teach." "I'd like that," Sarah said, looking up from the sympathy cards with something that might have been hope. "I'd like for you to be part of her life. But I want to make sure we're both clear about what that looks like." Over the next hour, we talked through the practicalities of a relationship that neither of us had expected to navigate. I would return to Oregon after handling the immediate aftermath of Marcus's death, but I'd come back for the birth and plan regular visits as the baby grew. Sarah would share updates and photos, include me in major decisions about the child's upbringing, and ensure that my granddaughter grew up knowing about her father's family history. It wasn't the same as the relationship I might have had if Marcus had lived, or if we'd reconciled years earlier, but it was a genuine connection, a bridge between past and future, that would allow our family story to continue despite the loss that had brought us together. "What will you tell her about why Marcus and I were estranged?" I asked, curious about how Sarah planned to explain the 8-year gap in our relationship. "The truth," Sarah said firmly, age-appropriately, but honestly. That families sometimes struggle with complicated feelings, that people make mistakes they later regret, and that love can survive even when relationships are damaged. I want her to understand that her grandmother never stopped loving her father, even during the years when they couldn't be part of each other's lives. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing, a call from her doctor's office confirming her appointment for the following week. The reminder of her pregnancy brought both joy and sadness, hope for the future mixed with grief for everything Marcus would miss. "He was so excited about being a father," Sarah said after hanging up. "We'd only been trying for a few months, but he'd already started planning how to convert the spare bedroom into a nursery. He had ideas about teaching her to ride a bike and helping her with homework and taking her camping in the mountains." "She'll still get to do all those things," I said. "With you, with friends, with the family who chooses to be present in her life. She'll grow up knowing that her father loved her before he ever met her, and that his love continues through the people who carry his memory." As the days passed, I found myself settling into a routine in Richmond that felt both temporary and strangely permanent. I helped Sarah with the endless paperwork that follows a death, sorted through Marcus's belongings for items that held sentimental value, and began the process of understanding my son's adult life through the evidence he'd left behind. His computer revealed years of architectural projects, including several designs for affordable housing that suggested he'd never completely forgotten his working-class roots. His bookshelf contained volumes on urban planning and sustainable design, indicating interests that went beyond commercial success to include social responsibility. His photo albums, which Sarah had never seen him look through but which were carefully maintained and organized, contained more images from his childhood than I'd expected. Apparently, Marcus had kept more memories of our life together than his public persona had suggested. Photos of birthday parties, school events, and ordinary family moments were preserved alongside more recent images of his life with Sarah. He'd curated his past carefully, keeping the positive memories while constructing a narrative that eliminated the complications. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was preparing to return to Oregon when Sarah made an unexpected suggestion. "What if you didn't go back right away?" she said as we shared coffee in the kitchen that had become our informal meeting place. "What if you stayed until after the baby is born? You could help me prepare for her arrival, and she could meet her grandmother right away." The offer was tempting for multiple reasons. Returning to Oregon meant going back to my quiet life at the auto shop, to the empty apartment where I'd spent 8 years missing Marcus, to the routine that had sustained me but never completely satisfied me. Staying in Richmond meant being part of something new, something growing, something that connected me to Marcus's future, rather than just his past. "Are you sure?" I asked. "That's months away, and I'd essentially be a permanent houseguest until then. That's a lot to ask of someone you've known for less than 3 weeks." "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "I need family around me right now, and you're the closest thing to Marcus I have left. Besides, I could use help getting ready for the baby, and you have experience raising children that I don't have." I thought about the practical implications of staying in Richmond for several more months. I'd need to arrange extended leave from work, or possibly consider it a permanent career change. I'd need to figure out living arrangements that worked for both Sarah and me. I'd need to build a life in a city where I knew almost no one and had no established community. But I'd also be present for the birth of my granddaughter. I'd be able to help Sarah through the challenging final months of pregnancy and the adjustment to new motherhood. I'd be creating a relationship with my son's child from the very beginning, ensuring that she grew up knowing her paternal grandmother rather than just hearing stories about her. "What about work?" I asked, thinking through the logistics. "I can't just disappear from the shop indefinitely." "You could look for something here," Sarah suggested. "Richmond has plenty of auto shops, and experienced mechanics are always in demand. Or you could do something completely different if you wanted a change." The idea of starting over professionally at 53 was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd been working at the same shop for over a decade, earning respect and stability in a field that didn't always welcome women. But I'd also been feeling restless lately, wondering if there were other ways to use my skills and experience. "I'll think about it," I said, though part of me had already decided. The pull of being present for my granddaughter's early life was stronger than my attachment to the familiar routines I'd left behind in Oregon. That evening, I called my supervisor at the auto shop to discuss extending my leave. The conversation went better than I'd expected. Apparently, my reputation for reliability had earned me enough goodwill that taking several months for a family emergency wasn't seen as an unreasonable request. "Take whatever time you need, Nady," Joe told me over the phone. "Family comes first, and it sounds like you've got some catching up to do. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." The easy acceptance made me realize how lucky I'd been to work for people who understood that life sometimes required flexibility. It also made me wonder whether I'd been undervaluing myself professionally, whether the loyalty I'd shown to one employer might translate into opportunities I'd never considered pursuing. Over the following weeks, I began to build a life in Richmond that felt both foreign and natural. I found a small apartment near Sarah's house, close enough to be helpful but far enough away to maintain some independence. I explored the city, learning the rhythms of a place that was larger and more diverse than anywhere I'd lived before. I started looking into job opportunities, discovering that my experience and skills were more transferable than I'd realized. The most surprising development was how easily Sarah and I developed a genuine friendship that went beyond our connection through Marcus. Despite the vast differences in our backgrounds and life experiences, we shared a practicality and emotional honesty that made collaboration feel natural rather than forced. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, providing a source of hope and anticipation that balanced the ongoing grief of losing Marcus. We spent hours planning the nursery, discussing names, and preparing for the reality of caring for a newborn. Sarah read parenting books with the same methodical approach Marcus had brought to researching major purchases, while I shared practical knowledge gained from 18 years of raising a child largely on my own. "Were you scared when Marcus was born?" Sarah asked one afternoon as we assembled a crib that had arrived in approximately 47 pieces with instructions that assumed a level of mechanical aptitude neither of us possessed. "Terrified," I admitted, wrestling with a component that refused to align properly with its designated slot. I was 25, completely broke, and had no idea what I was doing. Marcus's father had disappeared before he was born, so I was facing parenthood entirely alone. "How did you manage?" "One day at a time," I said, finally getting the stubborn piece to cooperate. I made a lot of mistakes, worried constantly about whether I was damaging him somehow, and discovered that babies are more resilient than new parents give them credit for. "I worry about making the wrong choices," Sarah confessed. "About disciplining her incorrectly or not providing enough intellectual stimulation, or failing to teach her important life skills." "You'll make mistakes," I said gently. "Every parent does. But you'll also love her fiercely and do your best to give her what she needs to become whoever she's meant to be. That's all any of us can do." As winter gave way to spring, Sarah's pregnancy became more visible and our anticipation more intense. We had established routines and rhythms that felt like family, even though we were still, essentially strangers learning to navigate a relationship that had begun under the most unusual circumstances. I found work at a garage specializing in foreign cars, a job that challenged me technically while providing the financial independence I needed to maintain my own apartment. My coworkers were curious about my background but respectful of my privacy, accepting that I was someone starting over for personal reasons that didn't require detailed explanation. On a warm April morning, Sarah woke me with a phone call at 5:30, her voice tight with excitement and anxiety. "I think it's time," she said simply. I drove to her house to find her pacing the living room, timing contractions with the methodical precision she brought to everything important. We gathered the hospital bag we'd packed weeks earlier and made the drive to the same medical center where Marcus had died 5 months before. The labor was long but uncomplicated, giving Sarah and me hours to talk through fears and hopes while we waited for my granddaughter to decide she was ready to join the world. Sarah was calmer than I'd expected, drawing on reserves of strength that reminded me of her deceased husband's steady determination. Isabella Rose Hawthorne was born at 11:47 p.m. on April 18th, weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with dark hair that promised to curl like her father's and eyes that would need time to determine their permanent color. When the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt a rush of love so intense it took my breath away. This was Marcus's daughter, the granddaughter I'd never expected to meet, the continuation of our family's story despite everything that had tried to interrupt it. She was impossibly small and perfect, a reminder that life continues even in the face of loss, that love finds ways to perpetuate itself across generations. "She looks like him," Sarah said from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "Around the eyes, I think." I could see it too, a resemblance that went beyond specific features to something more fundamental about the shape of her face and the way she held her tiny hands. Isabella carried Marcus's genetic legacy into the future, ensuring that part of him would continue long after everyone who remembered him personally was gone. The first few weeks of Isabella's life were a blur of feedings and diaper changes, of learning her preferences and patterns, of marveling at how someone so small could completely reorganize the lives of the adults responsible for her care. Sarah proved to be a natural mother, approaching parenthood with the same thoughtful preparation she'd brought to everything else, while I discovered that grandmothering was different from parenting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I could love Isabella completely, while bearing none of the ultimate responsibility for her well-being. I could enjoy her company without the constant worry that had characterized my experience raising Marcus alone. I could offer help and advice when requested, while respecting Sarah's role as Isabella's primary caregiver. The arrangement worked beautifully, providing Sarah with support she needed while giving me a purpose that felt more meaningful than anything I'd experienced in years. I was contributing to Isabella's development while building a relationship with Sarah that had evolved far beyond our initial connection through Marcus. 6 months after Isabella's birth, Sarah and I were sitting on her back porch, watching my granddaughter attempt to coordinate her hands well enough to grab toys that were just within her reach. The evening was warm and peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from feeling useful and loved. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, adjusting Isabella's position in her lap so she could better access the colorful blocks scattered on the blanket. "About the future, about how we want to handle things as Isabella gets older." "What kind of things?" "Visiting Marcus's grave, talking about him, keeping his memory alive for her. I want to make sure we're doing it in healthy ways that honor him without creating unrealistic expectations about the father she'll never know." It was a thoughtful concern, one that acknowledged the complexity of raising a child whose father had become idealized through death, rather than known through daily interaction. "We tell her age-appropriate truths," I suggested. "That her father loved her very much but got sick and died before she was old enough to remember him. That he was a good man who made some mistakes but who wanted the best for his family. That he would be proud of the person she's becoming." "And about us? About why you weren't part of his life for so long?" "We tell her that families sometimes struggle with complicated feelings, but that love can survive even when relationships are difficult. That her grandmother never stopped caring about her father, even during the years when they couldn't be together." Sarah nodded, bouncing Isabella gently as she considered this approach. "I want her to understand that people can make mistakes and still be worthy of love. That forgiveness is possible even when relationships seem broken beyond repair." As Isabella grew from infant to toddler, our carefully planned approach to discussing Marcus proved both necessary and successful. She was a curious child who asked questions about everything, including the photographs of her father that decorated the house and the stories we told about his life. "Daddy died before I was born?" she asked one afternoon when she was 3, studying a picture of Marcus that Sarah kept on the mantelpiece. "That's right, sweetheart," Sarah confirmed. "He got very sick before you were born, and the doctors couldn't make him better." "But he loved me?" "Oh yes," I said, settling beside her on the couch so I could point to the photo she was examining. "He loved you so much. Before you were even born, he was planning all the things he wanted to do with you when you got older." "What kind of things?" "He wanted to teach you to ride a bicycle and help you with your homework and take you camping in the mountains," Sarah said, listing the dreams Marcus had shared during his final weeks. Isabella absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to complex realities. Her father was someone who had loved her but wasn't present, like characters in the books we read together, or relatives she'd heard about but never met. As she grew older, her questions became more sophisticated, but our approach remained consistent. Honest answers that acknowledged both Marcus's love for her and the complicated circumstances that had shaped our family's story. "Why wasn't Grandma Nady at my father's house when he was sick?" she asked when she was 5, having noticed that all the photos of Marcus's adult life excluded me. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that make it hard for them to spend time together," I explained. "Your father and I had some hurt feelings that kept us apart for a while, but we fixed those problems before he died." "So you weren't mad at each other anymore?" "No, sweetheart, we weren't mad at each other anymore. We remembered that we loved each other, and that's what mattered most." These conversations became easier over time, as Isabella developed the emotional maturity to understand that relationships could be complicated without being catastrophic. She grew up secure in the knowledge that she was deeply loved by both her mother and grandmother, that her father had adored her despite never meeting her, and that families could overcome difficulties through patience and forgiveness. Now, 5 years after that 1,000-mile walk that changed everything, I watch Isabella play in the same backyard where Marcus once dreamed of teaching his children to garden. She carries his curiosity and Sarah's determination, creating a future none of us could have imagined when I first stood outside that hospital in Richmond. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.